Welcome, everybody. As you know, you're in the middle of a festival, and its topic, for those who have not attended recently, I just shall repeat. You know, the city, the University of Heidelberg, when they got this new building in the 20s, early 30s, they were competing for a slogan, the proper slogan. And strangely enough, the Jewish recommendation won. His books were burned a few years later. And it was called To the Lively Spirit. So the topic or the title of our festival, Geist Heidelberg, does reflect this. But in a way, it's ideal today if we consider the liveliness of a spirit. We very often think of flying spirits as far as literature and stories go. You all know, you might evoke Icarus, Pegasus, and others, but in a more common and daily experience, we talk of a lively mind. We talk of traveling with our minds. And so it's, in a way, it was a must to invite Richard Dawkins to this festival. His most recent book has the title Flight of Fancy. And the Heidelbergers, who grew up with Max Weber, and his concept of disenchantment of the world through rationalization and intellectualization. Of course, you can imagine this book, outside the Flight for Fancy of Fancy, is an antidote. It's just the opposite. It's actually inciting the fascination for the perception of reality with all our real senses. So we were very happy to convince and persuade Richard to come to Heidelberg again. As you know, he is probably the most prominent evolutionary biologist. All these famous books, bestsellers, The Selfish Gene and others. But here, in this attempt to convince the public, the broad public, the world public, to trust the fascination of reality, he has actually had an earlier book which was called Magic of Reality. So, Flights of Fancy, Magic of Reality, is in a way an ideal rear wind for what we are aiming at in our festival. There are several forces behind the achievement that we have him actually tonight. There is a German branch of the Richard Dawkins Foundation, and they celebrate their 10th anniversary this year. But in order to make this a real event, we of course need the man of the night, Richard Dawkins. So welcome to Heidelberg. But if you look into the book, you will find wonderful illustration without which they wouldn't have that appeal. And this is due to Jana Lentsova, okay. And now I guess we all want to hear him speak. And to make him speak, we have a wonderful friend. She has been here before. She's a journalist who works for various information agencies, among them the Humanistische. And her name is Daniela Wakonik, and she will now interview Richard Dawkins. Welcome tonight.
Well, hello, Richard.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being with us tonight. And hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight, too. Just a little information, there will be a Q&A after the talk. And after the Q&A, there will be a book signing on the stage. And you'll have the opportunity to buy some books in case you've forgotten your books at home. In front of the doors. Okay, Richard, before we start talking about your latest book, I just learned that you have recently started a podcast and a YouTube channel. What is that about?
It's called The Poetry of Reality, and I have before said that science is the poetry of reality. And I was persuaded to do it by an enterprising person called Desh Amila, who runs such things. And so he fixes me up with people to interview, and I've interviewed several so far. And we run previous things on YouTube, that sort of thing.
Oh, interesting. So maybe you have a look on YouTube and, yeah, find some interesting talks and podcasts there. Okay, now let's talk about your latest book, Flights of Fancy. We heard a bit about it in the introduction. Yeah, but Flights of Fancy, what is it about?
It's about flight in birds, bats, pterosaurs, and insects, not in that order. Insects got there first by quite a long way, and then pterosaurs, and then bats and birds. And also humans, of course, and human technology has solved the problem of flight rather late in the day. And the principles are similar. The laws of physics are the same whether you're a bird, a bat, or a human. But human technology does it in a rather different way, as you know. So each chapter is about different ways in which any creature, including a plane, can get off the ground, can defy gravity. So one way is balloons, and only humans have done that, lighter-than-air machines. Another way is to simply be very, very small. If you're tiny like a gnat, your surface area, this mathematical necessity, your surface area is very, very much larger compared to your weight than if you're a large animal, because for any given size, area goes up as the square of the linear dimension, whereas volume and therefore weight goes up as the cube of the linear dimension. So for something like Pegasus, the flying horse, to get off the ground, it's virtually impossible. Whereas for a gnat or a pollen grain, no effort at all. You just more or less float. Given that you are too large to just float like that, how else could they do it? Well, one way is to glide, to soar on thermals, and vultures and eagles and people like that do that. So do glider pilots do that. Another way is powered flight, either pushing air down like a helicopter, or rushing forward at great speed with a wing tilted like that, so you get Newtonian lift or lift by Bernoulli's principle. That's how planes do it. Birds do a combination of the helicopter way of doing it and the plane way of doing it, powered flight. Weightlessness is a form, I suppose, of flight. It's actually not, but it feels like it. And only humans have done that in the normal way that we think of. But if you actually think in another way, a flea, when it leaps in a parabolic trajectory, is weightless during the time during the time of its jump. It's weightless in just the same sense as an astronaut who goes up and becomes weightless. Alan Shepard, the first American astronaut, who didn't actually go into orbit, he did very much more like a flea jump, and was weightless. So in that sense, fleas and grasshoppers and jumping spiders are all weightless during the time that they do it. And then there's a chapter on what is the use of half a wing. One of the favorite ploys of creationists is to say, it's all very well for a bird, thing like a bird that has a wing that's already fully formed to fly, but what about the intermediate stages? How did the first steps, evolutionary steps on the road towards flying work? What's the use of half a wing? And there are numerous animals that glide. There are flying squirrels, there are marsupial equivalents of flying squirrels in Australia that glide from a high point in the forest to a lower point. So they're falling all the time, but falling in a controlled way. And we can see that as a possible step towards true flight being where they stay in the air indefinitely. There are gliding lizards which stick their ribs out, and they have a skin joining the ribs together, a membrane joining the ribs together. So they glide like that. There are flying snakes, which again leap from a high tree, and they have a flattened body, and they sort of do a sinuous motion like that through the air. Flying frogs, which have a membrane between their fingers, like bats do, but of course bats have a much larger wingspan. So, yeah. Oh, and plants too. Plants don't fly in the ordinary sense, but they need to spread their seeds, they need to spread their pollen, and some of them do it just by wind, but some of them borrow the wings of animals. As you know, butterflies and bees and hummingbirds are pressed into service by flowers to carry their pollen. So I see this as a kind of way. Plants have wings, but they're borrowed wings. I better shut up and let you get the next question.
Yeah, I very much liked, that's my favorite chapter, about angel wings. When you discuss how big angel wings should be, or would have to be, in order to fly, to make the angel fly, and where are the wings fixed at the body?
Well, as I said, the surface area of an animal goes up as the square of the linear dimension, and the weight goes up as the cube. So if an angel was a human with wings, it would be very, very difficult to fly. There's a famous picture of the Annunciation by Leonardo da Vinci, and the wings are far, far too small. So Jana redrew the painting, but with wings in proportion, and they're gigantic. But then there's the problem of how it would actually fix the wings. It would need an enormous breastbone, far bigger than a chicken, which has a big enough one, and that doesn't even fly very well. So if an angel really flew, the breastbone would reach right out there. In fact, it would touch the Virgin Mary, who's sitting on the other side of the table.
What was the most amazing fact you learned yourself when you researched for this book?
Gosh, what do I think? Well, there was a gigantic pterodactyl called Quetzalcoatlus, which was the size of a small plane, the size of a Piper Cub or something like that, a Cessna plane. How it flew is a bit of a mystery. There's an American inventor called Paul MacCready who built a half-size model of Quetzalcoatlus, which did fly, half size, but it probably would have only glided. I imagine it probably went on high places and took off, because taking ordinary flapping flight would have been very hard for such a gigantic animal. There's nothing else ever flown as big as that.
When I read the book, I thought, wow, it's actually a kind of crash course to evolution, to science, technology, using the example of flight. And I wonder, why flying? Why did you use flying as a vehicle?
Well, the director mentioned another book of mine called The Magic of Reality. And The Magic of Reality is a series of chapters in which each one answers a question, like what is an earthquake, what is the sun, why do we have winter and summer, why do we have day and night. And it occurred to me it might be rather fun to write a second edition with 10 more questions like that. And I thought that the first of those chapters might be something about flight. But then it proved to be such a big subject that it grew into a whole book. So that was how I chose to write about flight. It is a subject that raises a whole lot of interesting questions. One could do a similar thing on something else, but flight is a particularly good one. And as you rightly say, it is possible to use flight to illustrate a lot of evolutionary principles.
Why isn't there a German edition of the book?
It's a very good question. Anybody feels like complaining to German publishers why they haven't published this book, I'd be most grateful. Because all my other books have been published in German and they've done very well. So it's a bit of a mystery.
But are you
publishers here?
Stand up. Are you searching for a translator or just a publisher?
Sorry.
Are you searching? Are you looking for a translator or just a publisher?
Oh, there's no problem getting a translator once a publisher agrees to.
But you have favorite translators, don't you?
Well, yes. The translator of my first book, The Selfish Gene, was extremely good, and I know this because I had a letter from a lady in Germany who wrote to me, and she said, "This translation is so good, it's as if author and translator were twin souls." So I was very impressed with that, and I looked up the name of the translator, and it was Carine de Souza Ferreira. Well, I was very impressed, and I happened to meet Hans Kummer, who is a famous Swiss-German biologist, and I told him this story that I'd heard that the translator was so good that it was as if author and translator, I didn't mention her name, I just said it was as if author and translator were twin souls. And he stopped me and he said, "Carine de Souza Ferreira?" And that really impressed me. That was a good witness. So I asked if she could translate my next book, and she graciously came out of retirement to do so. So I'm very grateful to her. I can't hope she is in this audience, but if she is, I'm very grateful to her.
So Flights of Fancy is an illustrated book, beautifully illustrated, as we have just learned by Jana Lenzova, who is sitting down there just in case you want 2 autographs after the talk. Illustrated books are sometimes meant just for children. Is Flights of Fancy a book for children or for adults or for both of them?
Well, it's a bit of both. It ended up by being sort of for young adults, but that really means, I think, any adult. I suppose it's true that the words that I use are a slightly limited vocabulary. So I did have young people in mind when I was children in mind, but I hope the book could be enjoyed by people of any age.
We are going to talk about children and science education. This is one of the topics of this talk. And when I remember my school days, many of my colleagues didn't like science lessons. They saw science is just boring. Of course, it isn't. But do you think that science education in school has to change in order to inspire more young people?
It's beyond belief that anybody could find science boring. I mean, after all, science explains everything about the world, everything about us. Biology, evolution explains why you exist, what you're for, what your antecedents are, what the history of events that led to your existence is. Astronomy tells you about the universe in which you live. How can anybody ever find science boring? I think there are various approaches which can make it more or less interesting, and I'm slightly heretical because there are many people who feel that the way to make science interesting is to bring it down to earth and to explain the science of cookery or something like that, to make it familiar to everyday life. I don't subscribe to that view. I think I prefer the Carl Sagan way of inspiring the poetry of reality, the poetry of the universe, the poetry of geological time. I think that's what really should get children excited.
But do you think there's a specific challenge to arouse interest in children into science?
Well, there are challenges in the more mathematical sciences. I mean, many people do find mathematics difficult, and so being trained to be a practicing scientist may be rather different from being taught to love science and to be inspired by science. Maybe it's a bit like music, where you can love music and appreciate music at a high level without ever learning to play an instrument. And I suppose if everybody was forbidden to listen to music until they could play an instrument, that would be very sad. And so I think teaching science, teaching people to appreciate science, may be rather different from teaching people to actually be a scientist. We, of course, do need scientists, and that means, certainly in the case of physical sciences and increasingly in biology, that does mean mathematics. But Charles Darwin was an extremely poor mathematician. He turned to his son George whenever he needed a mathematical problem solved.
Okay. The Richard Dawkins Foundation in Germany has a program. I think you brought something on stage?
Well, yes. I mean, I've been very inspired to see the efforts of people in the Richard Dawkins Foundation, for example, Ramona Wagner, producing these wonderful games for children to inspire them in science. Well, your own book is very nice. I've got these things here. I had a nice time in the English language library today looking at the exhibition that's been put on. So I'm very proud of the German branch of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for what they're doing in this field.
Okay, so in case there are teachers down there who are interested in getting material for teaching science to children, get into contact with the Richard Dawkins Foundation in Germany.
And also in America, there's a parallel initiative specifically about evolution, run by Bertha Vasquez, who is a very good science teacher herself. And she has started, well, the Richard Dawkins Foundation in America started this initiative to teach teachers how to teach evolution. And in America, this is a special problem because, as you know, half of America are religious maniacs. And an incredibly large number of Americans think the world is only 6,000 years old. And unfortunately, many of the children are brought up by parents who believe this. And so teaching evolution to children in America is an additional problem. And Bertha has had some children who actually turn their chairs to the wall and don't listen when she teaches evolution. So she started these courses to teach teachers how to combat this problem, how to teach evolution in a way that will interest the children, and how to handle the controversy that arises. And she's now run courses in all 50 states to do this, very, very successful courses. And I'm glad to say she's now become full-time education officer of the Richard Dawkins Foundation in America.
I think that's one point, because when we talk about scientific education, we have to talk about religious education. In most Western countries, if not all, children learn religious myths before they learn science, before they are educated in science. I think that's a problem.
Yes, I mentioned the magic of reality earlier, and the pattern of each chapter in the magic of reality begins where the chapter heading is a question, like what is an earthquake? And then the beginning of the chapter is myths, mythical explanations for whatever the question is, mythical explanations for night and day, mythical explanations for winter and summer, etc. And then comes the scientific explanation. So I gather these myths from all over the world, and including the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic myths, which they just come like all the other myths, so that the children who read this book get the idea that the myths they've been brought up with, if they've been brought up as Muslims or Jews or Christians, that these are just myths among many myths from all over the world. And then they get the true scientific explanation. I think one of the most powerful arguments against creationism is to point out that it is just one of hundreds of myths from all over the world. It happens to be the Jewish myth, which has been spread by various historical accidents and become extremely widespread. And I think that's a powerful weapon against belief in mythical explanations rather than scientific explanations. Scientific explanations are so much more wonderful. I mean, mythical myths are poetic. They do have a certain beauty, but science has immeasurably greater beauty. And if you really understand the scientific explanation for the origin of life, the origin of the universe, evolution of life, and so on, it is so much grander, so much more beautiful, so much more poetic.
When you think back to your own childhood, you were brought up religious? You even were a choir boy?
Well, I was, yes. I mean, like most children, I was sent to schools where religion was taught, and we went to chapel every Sunday, and actually most days. And I was in the choir, yes.
Do you remember when science stepped into your life and what it did to your belief, your religious belief?
Well, yes. I specialized in biology, and I was very fascinated by the beauty and the elegance and the complexity of life. And for a time, I was convinced that this had to mean that it was all designed. And so when I finally understood the power of Darwinian natural selection, that blew up all vestiges of religious feeling that I had, which yes, I mean, that happened when I was about 15 or 16, I suppose.
Rather late.
Yes, you could say so. I understood from my mother much earlier than that there were lots of different religions, and therefore they couldn't all be right. And I got that. But I retained, after that, I retained this sort of deistic feeling that there must be something more than just physics.
For quite a while in the 20th and 21st century, it looked like the world seemed to emancipate from religion by accepting a more scientific worldview. And meanwhile, there seems to me a backlash of religion. Would you agree?
I haven't noticed that in the world in which I move. I don't think I've noticed that. What have you noticed there?
Islam is coming back. Is coming back into Western countries. Religions, yeah. Christianity is going back, but other religions are coming.
Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. I mean, I think Islam is another matter, and I'm not sure about that. I do get encouraging indications from Iran, from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, that there is something of a backlash against Islam, but of course it has to be rather secret because the consequences can be rather severe. My American foundation, Richard Dawkins Foundation in America, has an initiative called the Translation Project, which is translating my books into the languages of the leading Islamic countries, that's to say Arabic, Persian, Indonesian, and Urdu. And these translations are for free download as PDF. It has to be PDF because nobody wants to be actually seen reading such a book. And it's free, there's no charge. And we do know that very large numbers of these PDFs are being downloaded. So that's an encouraging sign. But as for the Christian world, I think all this statistical evidence suggests that it's going in the right direction.
Yes, but if you look at Turkey, for example, you have since 2017, evolution is no longer taught in schools. Then let's go to India. This year May, I think, they stopped teaching evolution in school. So there seems to be some kind of backlash. Yes,
that may well be. And in Turkey, I know there are these huge picture books. I've forgotten. Well, even if I could remember the name of the man, I probably wouldn't give him publicity. But they're very, very high production books, highly coloured pictures, which are anti-evolution books, and they're sent free to all sorts of people all over the world in many languages. I think. They're astonishingly bad. I mean, I said the production value is high, the pictures are good quality, but the naivety of the man is just astonishing. I mean, and there are his strategy is to have a fossil on one page, and then a modern animal on the opposite page, which look the same, look alike. So you see, there's the fossil, there's the modern animal, and it looks the same. So, for example, he'll have an insect preserved in amber. That's very ancient. And then a modern insect, which looks similar. But the modern insect is not an insect at all. It's a tide fly, the sort that trout and salmon fishermen tie. It's even got a hook sticking out of its back end. And there are amazing solecisms. There's an annelid worm which is confused with an echinoderm. I mean, these are opposite ends of the animal kingdom. You couldn't possibly, if you knew any biology at all, if you had a smidgen of biology, you couldn't make that sort of mistake. But they're produced in enormous numbers. Every biologist I know has been sent these books, and we just laugh at them. But I suppose they probably have an influence somewhere, and that's Turkey.
Yeah. Apart from religion, there is another, well, let's say, threat to science, or at least to scientific education. And that's something I would call a misguided fight against racism and discrimination. I'm talking about the idea that science is just the white man's concept of getting to know the world, while there are other concepts like indigenous concepts that should be treated equally. I mean, there has just been this famous case in New Zealand where now the Maori wisdom is taught alongside scientific facts.
Yes, I just got back from visiting New Zealand earlier this year and met with a group of distinguished scientists, met them for lunch, and they're very worried because the New Zealand government is so, for the best of reasons, and the noblest and charitable reasons, bending over backwards to incorporate indigenous Maori knowledge. And so the official government policy, at least of the Labour government, which has now actually been voted out in New Zealand, the official government policy was to incorporate Maori myths, really, and give them equal status, equal standing in science education with what they call Western science. That's a misnomer. It's not Western science. It's just science. It belongs to all of humanity. And calling it Western science implies that it's, as you said, it's a kind of white, patriarchal, dominated form of knowledge, which has no more going for it than the knowledge of the Maoris or Native Americans or Kikuyu or any other indigenous mythology. And, well, I hope it's not necessary to even say that science actually works. Science flies you to the moon. Science flies you to Pluto. Science cures polio, cures smallpox. And to teach these unfortunate New Zealand children, on the one hand, about the wonders of DNA, and on the other hand, say it's all done by the Earth Mother and the Sky Father. These poor children are going to be confused, to say the least. And I think this is a very, very pernicious, but very, very well-meaning attempt to, as I said, bend over backwards to respect other cultures.
In your opinion, what should we do and what can we do against this postmodern approach?
Well, I'm not sure what the politics of it are. I mean, the scientists that I met had been very badly treated. They wrote a letter to a New Zealand journal called The Listener, and the letter was written in very moderate, respectful terms, but they were threatened. They were threatened with expulsion from the New Zealand Royal Society, and their lectures were cancelled because students said they would feel unsafe being lectured to by these distinguished scientists. And the same kind of thing is, I fear, happening in other parts of the world as well, in America as well.
Yeah, what can we do? What can we do to stop it?
Well, I'm not a politician. I mean, I just speak my mind. They speak their mind and they get penalized for it. I think all we can do is do our science and explain that it really does work. As if that wasn't obvious.
Well, the older I get, the more I'm fascinated of our species, I must say. We're capable of so many things. We have so fantastic traits. We have discovered the laws of nature. We have invented many fantastic things. We are able to understand the consequences of what we're doing, like climate change, pollution of the environment, nuclear bombs, whatsoever. We have the abilities, yet we don't act accordingly. And I wonder, do you think we, from an evolutionary point of view, will make it? Our species? Will it make it?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because, as you say, we are an astonishing species. It's quite amazing. Not just science. I mean, when you think of Mozart, Beethoven, Shakespeare. I mean, it's just... and then to say nothing of Einstein and Newton and Darwin. And as you say, science can predict the likely consequence of our actions. We know about climate change. We know about what's going to... The next pandemic may be much worse than the one we've just lived through. We have the scientific knowledge to know what ought to be done, but translating that into action is a matter of politics. It's a matter of persuading people to do the necessary thing. And that often means persuading people to value the future more than future gain, more than immediate short-term gain. And economists have this concept of discounting the future, of making a decision between how much you value getting gains in the future from getting gains in the near future, from the distant future compared to the near future. In experiments with children have been done where you offer them the famous marshmallow test, where you give them, say, do you want one marshmallow now or two marshmallows tomorrow? And children of a certain age find it very hard to value the future. And humanity as a whole finds it very hard to value the future. In some cases, we have to be aware of the future after we're dead. I mean, how much do you value the humanity going on after you're dead? And I certainly do, and I think most of us here do, but there's a certain sort of sense in which you value your own future a little bit more than you value the future of your great-great-great-grandchildren. And so it is a problem which humanity has to solve. Humanity is the only species which could even come close to solving that problem. I mean, Darwinian natural selection, for all the wonders that it produces, one thing it cannot do is have foresight. It has absolutely no foresight at all. And if a species is going extinct and short-term selfish advantage of individuals of that species are leading to species extinction, that is just too bad. That happens. There is absolutely no Darwinian mechanism that values the future. All it can do is value the immediate present, the selfish immediate present. So humanity is unique in all sorts of ways that you've mentioned, and also unique in being the only species that even has a hope of taking action to guard the future. And so, difficult as it is, we're the only species that can do it. So let's just hope.
Let's talk, talking about the future, let's talk about a bit more profane thing, your next book.
Oh.
Just a bit more profane. It will be out next autumn, I think, and it's called The Genetic Book of the Dead. That's a very promising title. What will it be about?
The Genetic Book of the Dead. Okay, it's aimed at the same audience as The Selfish Gene, so it's aimed at grown-ups, not children, although I hope intelligent children will like it as they like The Selfish Gene. It's illustrated, again by Jana, and with lots of photographs as well. The theme is this: you are a written description of the worlds that your ancestors inhabited. So is any animal. The animal can be decoded and will be decoded by the zoologist of the future as a work of a textual description, a work of literature, describing all the worlds, the hazards of that your ancestors, the animal's ancestors, survived. This necessarily has to be a palimpsest, not a familiar word. It means, it's used in literature to mean a document which has been erased, parchment, for example, it's been erased and then written over. I'm using the word palimpsest in the metaphorical sense, because if you are a description of ancestral worlds, those ancestral worlds include very ancient worlds, slightly less ancient, slightly less aged, slightly more recent, and so on. So it's a palimpsest, excuse me, or lots of descriptions of worlds overwritten, ancient worlds overwritten by more recent ones. A second theme of the book is, in the second chapter, uses the perfection of animal camouflage. You probably know that things like moths, stick insects, stick caterpillars, leaf insects, frogs, all sorts of animals have their environment beautifully painted on their back, on their surface. A desert lizard has a picture of sand and stones on its back. And the perfection of this camouflage is staggering. A stick caterpillar that doesn't just look like a long, thin stick. It has dummy leaf scars on it, bud scars on it. It looks exactly like a leaf. So natural selection, then, we know from the camouflage of these insects, natural selection, we know, is capable of shaping the external appearance of an animal with the utmost perfection. And there's absolutely, my point is, there's absolutely no reason to suppose that that perfection stops at the skin. It must pervade the whole of the inside of the animal as well. Every cell of the animal must be carved, must be shaped with the same degree of perfection as the external appearance of a moth that looks like a leaf, or a caterpillar that looks like a stick, or any of these other splendid examples of animal camouflage. So at present, it's much harder to discern this. You only need your eyes to see the perfection of a stick insect or a leaf insect. The zoologist of the future will need much more than just eyes to discern the same perfection in the details, the warp and woof of the animal. But that will come, and my book is a kind of appeal for future zoologists to do this discernment.
Time is flying, so I have one last question, and that is, you're dealing with science and how to make people understand science for decades, almost your whole professional life now. And yet your books are never a dry lecture. They are filled with a lot of emotion. And I wonder, what is it that makes you, after all this time, fall in love with science again and again?
Carl Sagan said, when you're in love, you want to tell the world. And he was in love with science, as am I, because it's true, and it's wonderful, and it is so powerful. It explains everything. It explains our very existence. It explains, as I said before, how could you not be in love with a subject that explains why you exist?
Perfect concluding words. Thank you, Richard Dawkins. Okay, my job is done now. I have asked enough questions. Now it's your turn to ask questions. There is a microphone over there in the middle of the row. Please queue up. Please queue up at the microphone. We have about half an hour for the Q&A. So please, no lectures, just ask questions. The shorter your questions are, the more people will have the opportunity to ask. So, are you ready, Richard?
Yes.
Okay, number one.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much for your interesting interview. Given Heidelberg's philosophical tradition, how interested are you in philosophies that argue conceptually, not empirically, that there are two realms, one of nature, one of spirit or Geist, and that religion is maybe best understood as talking about phenomena of the realm of Geist in a metaphorical way, and the realms don't really compete about the same kind of knowledge?
I've never really understood what is meant by spirit. It seems to me to be something which sort of vanishes the harder you look for it. So I am a great believer in reality, and reality is enough for me. Reality is beautiful, and I think if you want something more than reality, you need to look more carefully at reality and appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, Richard. First of all, it's an honor meeting you and seeing you for the first time live. My question is, I've read recently that you, along with Jane Goodall and a couple of other peoples, advocate for a human rights kind of system for our closest relatives, the apes, especially chimpanzees and bonobos. So I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on that, how such a system would look like or could look like, in your opinion?
This is an initiative of the philosopher Peter Singer. It's called the Great Ape Project, and he got together a group of authors, including, as you say, Jane Goodall and me, to write essays for a book called The Great Ape Project. It's kind of a publicity stunt, I suppose. I mean, Peter Singer believes, I mean, he's the sort of high priest of animal liberation, and so he believes in treating animals that have, or are likely to have, or we have reason to think have, sentience, can feel pain, fear, and so on, that they should be given the same kind of rights as humans. Not, of course, the right to vote, because that wouldn't be done in practice, but the right not to suffer, not to be imprisoned, not to be, not to have pain inflicted on them. My own, taking great apes first is just a kind of publicity stunt, as I say, to get people thinking. I think Peter would rather like to include all mammals and maybe more than that as well in the project. But the great apes was a start because they're our closest relatives. The fact that they're our closest relatives doesn't actually necessarily mean that they're the ones most entitled to this kind of consideration, because there's no reason to suppose that because they're our closest relatives, they are more capable of feeling pain or fear than, say, elephants or dogs. But it's a start, and that's the Great Ape Project, and you might be interested to look at the book called The Great Ape Project.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, Professor Dawkins. It's an honor meeting you in person. My question would be, what are the more recent developments in biology or the life sciences that you are most excited about, such as the more recent developments in oncology or perhaps gene editing, neurobiology and such? What are you the most excited about?
Yes, I suppose molecular genetics, it would be the main thing. Ever since Watson and Crick in 1953, it's been clear that genetics is deeply digital. Even from the time of Mendel, I mean, Mendelian genetics is kind of digital in a sort of a way, in the sense that genes are all or none. But Watson and Crick and the molecular biology revolution that followed them shows that the digital nature of it goes right into the nature of the gene itself. So in a real sense, modern biology has become a branch of information technology. And this is immensely exciting. It's staggering, really, when you think about it, that every single living creature that's been looked at has the same genetic code. That proves that we're all descended from one common ancestor, because the chance of the same genetic code arising twice is negligible. In my own field of evolution, molecular genetics is exciting because by comparing letter by letter the textual information in the genes of any two animals or plants, you can work out how close they are cousins of each other. And whereas Darwin could do this using anatomy, which is kind of vague by comparison, using these billions of letters that are in the genome, in principle, the entire pedigree of the whole of life could be worked out. So that's one aspect, but of course DNA sequencing is vital in medical science. The speed with which vaccines were produced to the COVID-19 virus is entirely due to the fact that the virus was sequenced instantly, just took no time at all. You can sequence the DNA of an organism in hours. So as soon as the sequence was known, then that meant that the people working on the vaccines could get to work. And that will be true of any future viruses that crop up. The prospect of developing vaccines quickly is very optimistic.
Thank you.
Hello, Richard. Thank you. I actually come from and born and raised in one of the most conservative places in Saudi Arabia. But I just wanted to say that the antidote to the delusion does work. So thank you, Richard, for changing my life.
Okay, good. Yeah.
My question is, in life, you're sometimes unlucky. You're just born in the wrong place and wrong time. And my experience with people is I don't know if it's completely incompatible that you can believe in science and also believe in some myth. And when I now try to influence the next generation of my people, do I have to go kind of radical, all in, you have to believe every single thing about science and forget everything that you knew from your culture?
Well, science, you can't just believe everything that science says because scientists disagree, but I think that's not what you mean. You mean, do you have to abandon the religion of your upbringing to take on board science? I have a rather heterodox view. My view is yes. However, there are plenty of religious scientists and some very good ones, and so they would answer no. And as I said, my view is rather heterodox, and certainly my colleagues in America who are fighting the good fight in favor of educating in evolution, one of the messages they try to get across is you can keep your religion, you don't have to abandon it, it's all compatible. Evolution is just God's way of doing things. I mean, that's what they say. I personally think that's nonsense, but I appreciate the effort of my colleagues in trying to educate in evolution, and if they think that's the best way of doing it, good luck to them. But as I say, in my view, it is incompatible.
Hi, thanks a lot for this talk, and also I have to say thank you for the selfish gene. I believe I was one of those intelligent children who really loved your book and then fell in love with evolution and biology. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Now, my question is about what you said, bending over backwards to fight and include people. Scientists have made a lot of mistakes. We have made a lot of mistakes which led to huge disasters and crises, still do. And do you think that there is a lot of untapped potential, for example, collection of medicinal herbs in Amazonas, or different species which scientists still discover by hundreds every year, simply by not tapping the potential of indigenous people, simply by not including them? Do you think that is bending over backwards?
I'm not quite sure I heard. Are you talking about indigenous wisdom with respect to medical
to everything.
Remedies.
To everything. The colonizers came to the New Zealand, for example, and the Aboriginal tribes did not have the right there. Until very recently, they're still fighting for their land. How is it bending over backwards, simply including them in the education of their older...
Fighting for the land is another matter entirely. I mean, that's a political matter which I have every sympathy, but that's nothing to do with adopting mythological beliefs and calling them science. I mean, you don't...
I'm not talking about fairy tales or myths. I'm talking about collective knowledge of generations of people that have been excluded simply because they didn't look white.
If the collective knowledge that they have gained over centuries works, then science will adopt it. It will become science.
When did it happen? Does it really happen?
Sorry, I don't want to kill you off, but look at the queue, how many people want to ask their questions.
Thank you. All I'm saying is that inclusion is a good thing.
Okay.
Good evening. So I have a 4-year-old son who unfortunately cannot be here tonight as it's a bit late for children, I guess. But while you were talking about children, about upbringing and about myths also, and about death, I had to think of a question that he, more or less asks me almost every night when I bring him to bed. And he tells me that he does not want to die. And I really often sense some sort of distress when he says that to me. So my question would be, what can you, in the name of science, say to that?
Well, that's very difficult. We are going to die, and my attitude to that is we better make the most of the life we've got. But when a child approaches you and asks you questions like that, I honestly don't know what to say. If I met somebody, not necessarily a child, but somebody who is dying, afraid of dying, perhaps already very close to death, and asked me for some consolation, or to say, do you think that I'm going to go to heaven or something? I could imagine lying to them to console them. I probably wouldn't, but I could imagine doing so. My own attitude to death is that I love life and I want to go on living. However, I think the notion of eternity is very frightening, and that's to me in a way what's frightening is eternity. And I think I rather want to spend eternity under a general anesthetic, which is what's going to happen. Whereas as I say, I love life and intend to go on living as long as I can, I don't think the idea of non-existence for eternity is frightening, because that's just like being under a general anesthetic. It's better to do it that way than to think about living for eternity, which would be, I think, intolerable.
Thank you.
But
yeah. When you were talking about like a possible lie, I had to think of that Maori myth you were talking about, and I guess maybe I will tell him that. I don't know, because that would be an option. But in the same way, I sense that there's already some sense of some kind of rationality that he has learned or experienced, in which I don't think he will believe me, that Maori myth. And yeah, that's just something I'm really unsure about.
I am too, yes.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. Thank you for the great talk. I have a question regarding the conflict in Israel. So what is your opinion on the conflict, and what do you think would be the best solution for the conflict?
Well,
yeah, sorry for the question, but I'm just curious.
It's not a scientific question. I mean, okay. I think it's a horrible, horrible situation. I think the unilateral provocative act by Hamas a couple of weeks ago was utterly appalling, and I think that the motivation for it goes beyond desire for Palestinians to have rights to land and things like that. I think a great deal of it was just plain, naked, anti-Jewish prejudice. And I have been shocked by the demonstrations that immediately followed in various parts of the world in favor of the Hamas action, even before there was any retaliation from Israel. It was entirely predictable that the Israeli retaliation would be horrible. War is horrible. War always has been horrible, appalling. I don't need to tell anybody in Europe how appalling war is. I think there is an asymmetry in the the way in which civilians have been hurt and are being hurt by the Israeli action on the one hand and by the Hamas action on the other, they are not comparable, because the Hamas action was a deliberate assault upon civilians, children, babies, old people, killing, raping, slaughtering in a horrible way. The Israeli action is conventional warfare, which has horrible consequences, and again, civilians get killed. But the Israelis are not going after civilians as a deliberate strategy, the way that Hamas were. So I think that I must admit to a great deal of sympathy for Israel in this conflict.
Just a short reminder. Quarter of an hour now. So half of the Q&A time is over. We have another quarter of an hour. Next one, please.
Okay. Just one question. Do you think there is a rise or decline in science denial? And what could be the reason? Is it something related to how people reacted to the restrictions of COVID-19, and that's why they started questioning science? Or what is the exact reason to this?
I must say I have been rather shocked by the anti-vaccination movement, political movement against vaccination. It's not entirely new. It doesn't seem to apply to smallpox vaccination or polio vaccination. Everybody seems to accept the desirability of that. There has been some opposition to the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, but it really came to a head with the COVID-19, where, for reasons which I find really quite obscure, enormous numbers of people have taken to the streets, taken to the public podiums to vocally oppose the COVID-19 vaccination program. What I see is the amazing speed with which several different vaccines were developed as soon as the COVID-19 virus was sequenced. I think it was a triumph of science. I don't understand the political motive, which is widespread and strong, especially in America, against vaccination. It may have something to do with some governments coercing people to wear masks, for example, which was obviously uncomfortable and unpopular. I think there was some misinformation, perhaps given out by some governments, not entirely surprising. The speed with which they had to act was almost inevitably going to lead to some mistakes being made. But on the whole, I think the opposition to vaccination, which is perhaps a manifestation of a more general opposition to science, is actually rather shocking.
Well, first, as someone from a background where I was never allowed to question religion in the slightest, I would like to say your talks have always been a source of comfort and sanity, so I would like to thank you very much for that. Second of all, in the interview, you said that you see countries such as Egypt or Saudi drifting away from religion. So I was wondering, as an Egyptian, I agree to that, but I think it's more exclusive in higher income classes. And so I was wondering what you think is driving that trend, and whether you think how you think socioeconomic factors are tied to theism in general.
If the trend is real, then I don't know what's driving it, and I'd like to know what you think. Yeah.
Well, I think it's quite obvious that it's more tied to people having higher incomes and living a certain lifestyle that maybe could be called Western, or yeah, in a way.
I see. That's a rather, okay. So you're saying something like that adhering to the strictures of Islam is rather incompatible with leading a nice Western lifestyle with drinking and driving cars and...
well, hopefully not drinking and driving at the same time, but
yeah.
Someone that enjoys the drink, enjoys a drink myself, you have to hide, of course, and yes, it doesn't go well with religion, so it kind of pushes you away. But at the same time, education, of course, can also help you be pushed in the direction of science.
Well, you could be right. I would much rather it was because people had read The God Delusion in Arabic, but perhaps you're right.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I come from a country where 99% are atheists in some towns from East Germany. I have a question regarding the challenge of postmodern philosophy and some ideologies that grew up out of them. You introduced the meme theory, and I think my theory is that if we develop it to a stronger, more sophisticated, broad theory, my topic, I'm working on this, then we have a strong counterpart to this postmodern philosophy. So what do you think? What should we do to develop meme theory? What's your idea about the potential of meme theory in future?
Memes are just my name for an analogy with genetic selection, because the selfish gene was all about the gene as the unit of selection, but because it is a replicator. Anything in the universe that replicates is potentially fair game for a form of Darwinian natural selection. And computer viruses are a good example of a replicator. And memes are units of cultural inheritance, units of imitation. And I never really intended it to be a theory of human culture. Other people have developed it into that. Your question is about how to use meme theory to combat postmodern nonsense, is that?
Is a good alternative, which more science connection.
I hadn't thought of it as a good alternative. I would welcome a good alternative, because my understanding is that postmodernism has become powerful in not scientific departments, but in departments of humanities, of arts. And I mean, my feeling is that science is the good alternative. Science, evidence-based science. The view that what is true is that which can be shown to be true by evidence, not what you feel ought to be true, or feel my kind of personal truth, which may be different from your kind of personal truth. That's, of course, all nonsense. But it is science itself, I think, which is the antidote to that. If meme theory could contribute to it, so much the better. But I would think it's science itself that is the main weapon. Yeah.
Good evening. So before my question, a fangirl moment, it's a great honor to meet someone who inspired me to get into biology and into science and research.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. I'm a biologist, so my question is actually scientific about the flights of fancy and the evolution of birds and anything that can fly. In the current world, what we have now, I think maybe albatross is the biggest animal that is capable of flight. So I was wondering if there is any theory or any explanation for external pressures that existed before and don't exist now, that we don't have such big animals like the prehistoric animals currently now, which are capable of flight, like a Pegasus.
That's a very good point. And there were, I mentioned Quetzalcoatlus, which was a pterosaur. There were birds, which were much bigger.
Right.
The book describes one seabird which probably flew rather like an albatross, probably glided over the water and used the up currents from the sea, and probably used the albatross method of flight, which is to fly into the wind to gain height, and then turn and then fly with the wind, gliding down. But your question is, why don't we have anything as big as that now?
Yeah, I was wondering if it's just by chance or if there are some external pressures that have reduced the size.
I don't have an answer to that, and it may just happen. After all, the past is much longer than the present, so in a way there's more opportunity to have any particular thing you might mention, such as extremely large size. So it could just be that, and nothing that interesting. It's not that there was something different in the past that made for larger size. It's just that the whole span of geological time is so huge that you would expect extremes to be not necessarily happen to be in the time that we are living in. In the case of giant dragonflies, which we know from fossils in the Carboniferous, there has been a suggestion that that was possible because the oxygen content of the atmosphere was significantly greater in the Carboniferous period. But that wouldn't account for these big birds that you're talking about, which is much later than the Carboniferous, of course. So I think my answer would be that it may be just not a real phenomenon. There's not a real fact that things were bigger in the past. It just may be that the past is longer.
Thank you.
Yep.
5 minutes to go.
Good evening, Professor Dawkins. My question is pretty general. I wanted to ask you what you think is the best argument that religious people have to prove the existence of a higher deity that they call God. I have another very short question that is, what question keeps you up at night? Like, what is it that you think about at night that you forget to sleep?
The first question was, what's the most convincing argument?
Argument, yeah, in your opinion.
Yeah. I am a little reluctant to answer that question because in the past when I've answered it, I've said something like, well, I don't think there is a good argument, but if I had to, if I was really compelled to, I would say so-and-so. And that immediately taken up. Oh, Dawkins is a theist after all, so I'm reluctant to answer it. If you really twist my arm, and I stress that, then I think I would say something. It wouldn't be in biology, unlike what William Paley's natural theology, who thought that the best arguments were in biology. I think. Biology is out. I mean, we've done biology. Darwin's done it, and his successors have done it, and that always was by far the most convincing argument. The complexity and the beauty, the elegance and the powerful, staggeringly powerful illusion of design in living things was the best argument, and it no longer is. Darwin destroyed it. So we're left with physics, and the fact that the fundamental constants of physics, things like the gravitational constant, there are sort of half a dozen of these numbers that where physicists know the value of the number, but they don't have any explanation for how they came about. And they also know that if any of these numbers were ever so slightly altered, the universe as we know it wouldn't exist. So we live on a knife edge of improbability in the early stages of the universe, and some people see that as an argument for a divine designer who set the physical constants to be exactly the right values, twiddling the knobs of these rheostats to give exactly the right value in order that galaxies should come into existence and chemistry should happen, elements should come into existence, and life should come into existence, and eventually we would come into existence. I don't find that a convincing argument, because it just pushes the question back, and you know, how did the designer come about? But that's as I said, if you really twist my arm, the physicist's answer to that is they have other reasons for believing in a multiverse, where each of many millions of universes has different values of the physical constants and laws. And we, of course, the anthropic principle, we have to be living in one of those minority of universes which have the necessary properties. But I'm not, I mean, yes, okay, that's the best I can do.
Do you still like to answer the second question? That is about the question that keeps you up at night.
I didn't hear the second question.
So the second question is, what question in physics, biology, or whatever keeps you up at night? Like, what is it that you think about the most?
I think consciousness. What is consciousness, and how did it evolve?
Thank you very much.
I'm afraid I have to disappoint some people now. Half an hour is over. You have to decide if you take some more questions or.
Well, let's have one more.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor, Mr. Richard. Your books were the spark for me to open my mind, and they changed my life. They inspired me to found the first network in Saudi Arabia for atheists, and it's supposed to be anonymous to obviously why, but at some point that changed, and because of some threats I had to flee and leave that country. Anyway, they have moved like a long way already to the road for openness and for new horizon for the whole region there. The question still, what is breaking them down from getting forward? How can they change what holding their mentality like 1,000 or 2,000 years back? What is the necessary change to change that?
I didn't really hear that properly. Did you say you came from a country, you had to flee from a country?
I came, I used to live in Saudi Arabia, and I had to leave it because of atheism.
Yes.
It's not acceptable there, and I made some network, online network, and because of it I had to leave Saudi Arabia.
Well, congratulations for that.
Yeah. Wasn't easy. But that was already 10 years ago. Now, I believe that they have already went like a long way towards progression, but they are still holding themselves back with their strong connection and like deep connection to their religion and to 2,000 years old ideas. What is the key change that can move them from trying to go along with the whole world and with science and progression and their place today?
Well, I wish I knew. I think I can only answer as I have before. Show them the evidence, and I'm delighted at the effort that you're making, and I encourage anybody else to make similar efforts. But I don't have any. I'm not a politician. I don't know how to influence people in Saudi Arabia or similar countries. I wish I did.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem.
Okay.